Hello, Earth Science students. Welcome. I am going to review today for the Unit 3 end of unit test. It has two parts. It has a multiple choice and a short answer section, so we're going to cover all of that information in this review video. Let's get started by reviewing about minerals. Unit 3 covers minerals and rocks, and so we'll talk about both things in this video. What are the 5 criteria used to determine if a substance is a mineral? Let's go through and check off or highlight. We'll check off the ones that are used to determine if something is a mineral. Hardness is a feature of a mineral, but it's not used to determine whether or not it's a mineral. But minerals have to be solid, so that's one of the things that we're looking for. Minerals also need to be inorganic. That means that they don't come from living things. They're also naturally occurring. They're not man-made. They have a definite crystal structure, and that's, sorry about that check there, and they have a fixed chemical formula. So those are the 5 criteria used to determine if something is a mineral. And then once we know that it's a mineral, we can look at its features, we can look at its hardness, we can look at its luster, and some other characteristics that we'll talk about next. One thing that I want to point out is that even though minerals may contain silicon and oxygen, they aren't necessarily made up of mostly this. This is true of a lot of minerals because the crust of the Earth is made up of mostly silicon and oxygen. But it's not one of the criteria to determine whether or not something is a mineral. Let's go ahead and look at the properties of minerals. Some observable properties, some can be observed just by looking at the minerals, others have to be tested in some form or another. So let's look at the ones that can be just observed without doing a test first. So first we have luster. Luster is when you look at the mineral, do you notice that it's shiny? Is it dull? Does it have a glassy appearance? So we use these adjective words to describe the way that the mineral reflects light. That is its luster. Next, this is another observable property. It's color, and it's just what color do you see when you look at the mineral. Streak is related to color, but you have to perform a test in order to determine the mineral's streak. It's the color powder that forms when that mineral is scratched on an unglazed piece of porcelain. And so we saw when you looked at the lab from Unit 3 that some minerals produced a different streak than the color of the mineral when you saw it. These are observable properties of minerals. Hardness is another property that you can observe, but you need to do a test in order to observe it. It is where the mineral falls on that Mohs hardness scale. So diamond is a 10, it's the hardest mineral. Talc is a 1, it's the softest mineral. So talc can be scratched by any other mineral, whereas diamond can do the scratching. Diamond can scratch other minerals. So those are observable mineral properties. Minerals are the ingredients or are the building blocks to make rocks. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different types of rocks that we learned about. The 3 types are igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. And let's go ahead here and match up which are which. So over here we have a piece of igneous rock. Igneous rock comes from lava and magma. When they cool down, they form igneous rocks, and that can either cool below the surface of the earth in the form of magma, or it can cool once that lava has erupted from a volcano, and depending on how quickly or slowly the igneous or that material cools, we'll get different types of igneous rock. Next, we have sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks form from sediments. This one over here, rock salt or gypsum, is an example of a sedimentary rock. You might see gypsum form or rock salt form when there's a shallow sea and the water evaporates from the sea, and the stuff that's left over would be that evaporated, or the stuff that's left over would be the precipitated salt, and so that can form a sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rocks can be stratified. They can form layers because they are compacted or cemented clumps of sediment that have formed over time. And lastly, we have metamorphic rocks. They are formed from intense heat and pressure. So sedimentary rocks or igneous rocks get smashed in between tectonic plates. So tectonic plate movement can cause intense pressure. It can also cause rocks to shift near an area of hot kind of pockets of magma, and that can cause metamorphic rocks to form. They can form either these foliated kind of banded patterns or non-foliated sort of speckled appearance rocks. And so those are examples of metamorphic rocks. Let's take a look in a little bit more detail. I'll move myself out of the way here. In a little bit more detail at the different types of rocks and some of their features. So we started with igneous rocks. They can be mafic or felsic, depending on if they have low or high content of silica. The mafic rocks have high silica content, whereas the felsic rocks have low silica content. The intrusive intrusive igneous rocks form large crystals underground because they will cool slowly, and so the crystals will have a long time to form. Extrusive volcanic rocks or extrusive igneous rocks cool above ground. They cool really quickly because that lava hits air or water, and so it cools down quite quickly, and they form small crystals because they don't get a lot of time for that crystal formation to develop. Rocks that are sedimentary can form by three processes, either chemical, clastic, or organic processes. Chemical would be something like I mentioned about evaporation or precipitation, so some sort of chemical event that would take place. A clastic rock forms when fragments of other rocks compact together over time, and organic sedimentary rocks form from the remains of animals or plants, so that they came from some sort of living source. That word organic tells us that it came from something that was living. Finally, metamorphic rocks can be formed by regional or contact metamorphism. Regional is when the rocks are kind of stuck in between plates, so due to that pressure from plate tectonics, or contact, they come in contact or get melted by nearby magma. And again, I showed you on the last slide about foliated and non-foliated metamorphic rocks. Let's take a look at the rock cycle, because that is how one type of rock can become any of the others depending on the processes that change them. So here in the rock cycle, we see metamorphic, sedimentary, and igneous rocks, and they can be changed by internal processes, things that happen within the earth, or external processes, things like over here I have the examples of wind, water, ice. So kind of processes that happen on the surface of the earth are external processes. They can change rocks, and internal processes like pressure can also change these rocks. So if an igneous rock is melted, it can become magma, and that can cool to become an igneous rock. If an igneous rock is morphed under intense pressure, it could become a metamorphic rock. If a metamorphic rock is exposed to high amounts of wind and rain, it can be weathered and eroded and become a sedimentary rock. And you can see that this cycle is a continuous process. It takes sometimes a long time for these rocks to form and change, but it is a process that continues to happen on the Earth's surface. In Unit 3, we also looked at river deltas. This is an example of the Nile River Delta in Egypt, and you can see that as the sediments are picked up, so as erosion and weathering takes place, as the water moves along the Nile River, it is carrying sediments which get dropped off, and we get this sort of fanned appearance, and these sediments are deposited right before that river hits its the source, where the Mediterranean Sea, where it's going to kind of dump its contents into the sea. So a river delta is a location where sediments are dropped off. Let's look at some different types of landforms and how they can be changed. We have grasslands, mountains, volcanoes, and sand dunes here. And sand dunes are formed from weathering and erosion and the events that have kind of moved this sand around. Although these other geological features that you see might have been shaped by these things, sand dunes, I would say, are the most sort of apparent, that we see lots of weathering patterns. We see erosion patterns. You can see those distinct patterns kind of left in the sand, and that's a result of erosion from wind. So let's talk more specifically about weathering and erosion. There are two types of weathering. Weathering is the way that rocks are broken down. They can either be broken down mechanically or physically. That's some sort of process where you change the shape or change the size of the particles of a rock. It's a physical process. It might be that water gets inside the rock and that water freezes, and when it expands, it breaks the rock. It could be rain hitting on the rock over time and just kind of breaking it down. It can be wind blowing against the rock for years and years and years, and it sort of breaks it down slowly. That is an example of mechanical weathering. Whereas chemical weathering involves breaking down a rock through a chemical process. That might be exposure to acid rain. It might be oxygenation causing rust to occur. So those would be chemical type processes. Erosion is when the broken down rock is moved away. It can be moved by water. So even though water can cause weathering, it can also cause erosion. Wind can cause weathering and erosion. Gravity can move broken down rock, and that can cause erosion. So erosion is the movement, weathering is the actual breaking down of the material. We also discussed soil in Unit 3, so there's some different characteristics of soil. We talked about how the one down here, example D and even example A, have that really kind of black look. That is a great type of soil for growing plants. It would be great for wildlife to live because there's lots of nutrients in that soil, and those nutrients can be a place for plants to grow and kind of bring that material into the food chain. When we look at, we said we need soil to grow strong plants and for roots to take hold. And when humans deforest or take down large areas of plants, we can destruct soil and we can erode, or the soil can be eroded because it gets exposed to things like wind, rain, and sort of elements of weathering that it might not have been exposed to if plants existed there and if plants were holding the soil in place. So erosion is something that can be a result if we don't take care of land management. Other important terms that you need to know for the Unit 3 test are ores. So an ore is any mineral that has economic value that we can take out of the earth and use for economic purposes. So iron ore, we can dig out minerals and we can use the iron to make, make substances. We can look for gold. We can look for sort of aluminum. Any mineral with an economic value could be considered an ore. Subduction is when one tectonic plate is sinking under the other, and you see that in metamorphic rock formation. Weathering, we just mentioned before, is the breakdown of rocks, whereas erosion is the movement of that material to a new location. And pegmatic is a term that goes all the way back to kind of formations of rocks. And pegmatic rocks form when igneous rocks cool very slowly and we get large crystals. So I'll just jump back up there because we talked about a different term. Extrusive and intrusive. So you would expect an intrusive igneous rock that forms large crystals could also be called a pegmatic rock. So all of this information you would expect to see on the Unit 3 test. Parts 1 and Part 2, the short answer, and the multiple choice section have all the information that we covered today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, let me know, and I'm happy to help you. Keep up the great work. Take care, everyone.